Welcome back to the show. Today I want to share some thoughts with you on the theme of focus your life. And the majority of what I want to share with you today is from a book by Brian Tracy called Focal Point. Now, Brian Tracy was one of my earliest teachers. I don't even know, a lot of his books, a lot of his audiobooks, and he was one of several people who taught me some very basics in life that I hadn't heard before. And I'm not going to get into all of what he instructs and what he's taught over decades, but you can get more information about him over at briantracy.com, briantracy.com. So again, I want to jump into the theme today of focusing your life. And if you're at least a little bit like me, there are days when you get a little bit out of focus because of life, because of struggles, because of distractions. So hopefully in the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, you'll hear some ideas that you can implement in your own life about staying focused. He says on page 8 of his book, Focal Point, you have to identify the areas that consume an enormous amount of time but contribute very little to your goals. Now, those include conversations that go nowhere. I've had people call me and FaceTime me fairly regularly that just want to shoot the breeze, that just want to talk, that just want to, gab, waste some time. Well, I'm still learning in my old age to not have too many of those conversations because they distract me from the work that I need to do, and maybe you too. Maybe you don't have to have certain conversations. He says in page 8, knowing what I know now, he writes, if I were not doing this now, would I start it up again today? Think about that a minute. What you're doing right now, would you continue to do it if you knew that what you're doing now brought the results that you're achieving or not achieving right now? For some of us, hindsight's 20/20. Some of us, we have no hindsight, sad to say, and that goes back to people that I talked about in prior shows that some people don't know that they don't know. He says on page 9, he began reducing and cutting back on the amount of time he was spending with 80% of his clients who contributed only 20% of his income. Now that goes back to relationships. There are people in your life, there are people in my life that do not contribute to your progress. In fact, they take you away from your progress in your life because they are distracting. They are people that don't have an agenda in life. They have chosen not to take the hard steps and make the hard choices in order to achieve some really cool stuff in their own lives. He also says, on page 9, by doing fewer things of higher value and discontinuing activities of lower value, he dramatically improved the quality of his life in every area within just a few months. There have been a few things that I've decided not to do anymore because they don't contribute to my progress. I want you to pause and think about that for just a minute. What things in your own life can you get rid of that are not helping you move forward in your life? Let me, again, pause, slow it down. What are a few things in your own life that you can get rid of that are not contributing to your growth and or your success? Think about it a second. Are there relationships? Are there habits? Are there foods that you eat that are not contributing to your good health? Are there places that you're going that are not contributing to your progression in life? Are there friends that you have that you need to part ways with because they are pulling you away from some of your ultimate goals in life? I'm asking you today to think about focusing your life in a little different way. A lot of these thoughts come from Brian Tracy's book called Focal Point. He says on page 10, today you are paid for accomplishments and not activities. You are paid for outcomes rather than inputs or the number of hours you work. He goes on to say, whatever your answer, from now on, resolve to spend more of your time doing more of the tasks that contribute the greatest value and enable you to achieve the most important results possible for you. Secondly, he says, identify the activities in the bottom 80% or the lower value one the time-consuming tasks that contribute very little to your results. He says on page 12, you are responsible. Stop and think about that a second. Sometimes you and I don't want to face the fact that we're responsible, do we? Sometimes we want to blame the world. We want to blame our past. We want to blame our family. We want to blame our genes. We want to blame our coworkers. We want to blame our neighborhood. We want to blame our next door neighbor. We want to blame our spouse or other people in our lives, instead of blaming the one in the mirror that's causing you and I to not move forward. He says on page 13, accepting responsibility gives you a tremendous sense of control over yourself and your life. Accepting responsibility, again, gives you a tremendous sense of control. I had to learn that. Started learning that, I should say, back in 1987. I was working at a photo lab in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was 17 years old at the time. And part of my job for part of the time I was there was sitting in a room, a pitch black room that was about, I don't know, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, maybe 7 feet by 8 feet or something. It was relatively small. And there was a machine in there that I was printing color senior portraits for high schools. So I would sit in this room for 7 or 8 hours a day, and that's all I was doing. I was moving a wheel, hitting a button with my foot, and processing stuff. So I realized real quickly that I did not want to be spending the rest of my life in a dark room, literally, forever. So I had to look in the mirror and say, John, you need to rethink some things in your own head of what is possible in your own life, because if you and I allow other people to dictate what we're qualified for, in quotes, then you're never really going to realize some really awesome things that you have at your own, that you can accomplish in your own way. He says on the same page, he says, on the other hand, when you make excuses or you blame other people or you complain or criticize, you give your power away. He says you don't escape responsibility by attempting to pass it off to other people. You are still responsible. Have you ever eaten out someplace and somebody messed up the order, whoever it was? The server that took responsibility for that mess up is the one who I think is the better server of the two, rather than blaming it on the cook or blaming it on the kitchen or blaming it on the person in charge of the place. They take responsibility for what's going on. When you and I take responsibility for our actions, not the actions of other people, because we can't control the actions of other people. I'm still learning that in my dense head, that I can't control the actions of other people, but I can control my actions. So when you control your actions and I control my action, stuff gets done. He says, see yourself as self-employed. You think about that a minute. Most of us are employed by an employer. So we think as an employee, then you are dependent upon the employer. I will tell you firsthand, as somebody who has had companies before, that the people that you promote in companies are people who view themselves as self-employed, who take responsibility for the actions and their activities and maybe step beyond their little box and do things that are extraordinary for the benefit of the employer. He says on page 14, he says, you then discipline yourself, listen, to focus all your energy and attention on those specific tasks. You say no to any activity or demand of your time that is not consistent with the most valuable work you can possibly do at that moment. Again, he repeats throughout the whole book, you are responsible. So he says on page 14, he says, what you concentrate on grows. What you concentrate on grows. He says, where your attention goes, your heart goes also. Have you ever been driving down the road and you find yourself looking at the wrecked car on the side of the road, or the guy who ran out of gas, or whatever's going on the side of the road, and you find your car meandering toward what you're looking at? That's human nature, isn't it? So when you and I get distracted by the stuff that's going on around us that doesn't impact us in any way, what's going to happen? You're going to start meandering and start leaning toward that direction. So having total focus at any given time is really essential. And if you're somewhat like me, that's one of my struggles, to stay focused at any particular task at any time. So I'm talking to me too, by the way, in this show. He says on page 16, he says, what psychologists and others have discovered is that the very act of observing a behavior, listen, tends to change that behavior for the better. How many times haven't you heard stories of people who are alcoholics or drug addicts or smokers or whatever, and they wanted to change that habit? They first had to recognize that it is a habit and that it is impacting their life in a negative way. He says, when you consciously focus on these areas, you will perform better and better. So it's really, he says, the law of increasing returns. When you focus on what you want to get better at, generally speaking, with effort and habits and systems in place, you tend to get better at what you're trying to accomplish. We're talking today about focusing your life from Brian Tracy's book called Focal Point. He says, we form habits, then our habits form us. We form habits, and then our habits form us. One German philosopher said, everything is hard before it's easy. Duh. Everything is hard before it's easy. But the hard part for most of us is deciding to do the hard work consistently in order to develop the habits that are long-lasting. The people I read about, even though they've developed habits that they've been doing for a long time, some days are still difficult to get up and do those things that have been ingrained in them to do them anyway. But they do it because they know the law of returns is far greater than going backward and doing things that are easy. He says on page 20, he says, good habits are hard to develop, but easy to live with. But bad habits are easy to develop, but hard to live with. Have you ever seen people that have got stuck into a rut of a bad habit? Now that bad habit has been going on now for 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40 years in some cases. So those habits are almost impossible to break. It's much harder, in my opinion, to break a bad habit than to develop good habits. He says on page 21, is there anything I'm doing right now, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't get into again if I had to start over today? Think about that a minute. Think about the things that you're doing right now that if you would have known last year or 2 years or 10 years ago that it would have turned out this way, you wouldn't have even gotten started. He says you need to leverage your time. That's been one of my secrets. Back in, in the mid-1990s, I worked with a guy named Johnny Tucker. Johnny Tucker was roughly 15, 20 years older than me. He had much more experience than me, and he would coach me from time to time on leveraging my time better. He said, John, you're doing certain things that you can pay other people to do them to free up your time for you to do the things that are more productive. And at that time, I was in my, say, late 20s, and I wasn't hearing it. It wasn't sinking in. I didn't think that this old guy, he was only in his 40s back then, this old guy knew what he was talking about in that regard. Well, it took me a number of years after that to eventually to listen to his advice, to follow his advice, which his advice in that case was completely factual and truthful. And I was able to leverage my time just like he had been trying to coach me years and years earlier because I listened to his advice. I focused my energy on things that gave me the best return. Stop and think about this right now a second. What are you doing right now, every day, every week, that's not giving you a good return on your time? You say, well, John, I'm only 20-some years old. I'm only 30-some years old. I get that. But one day you're going to wake up and you're 60 and you're 70, and it's going to happen like real fast. So if you don't take an inventory right now of how you're spending/investing your time today, then time is going to go by so fast that you're going to miss and waste years and decades of your life that you cannot get back. Think about that a minute. Think about where you are today, right now, watching the show right now, and think about what you've lost in time because you've wasted so much time. You've failed to realize that time is finite and that you thought time was going to be forever, and you've not leveraged it properly, and now you're much older and you've made some mistakes. He said you leverage your strengths and your abilities to achieve more than you thought you could. One Greek philosopher, he said, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand and I can move the world. Now I learned this early in my career, that there is a great way to leverage some things. And I've learned to leverage other people's knowledge. And for that, and I can only thank my dad for that, and maybe a few other people, is that when you read books by and or about people that are smarter than you, then you are literally standing on their shoulders to learn what they've learned over the course of a very long time. So as Brian Tracy says, the first form of leverage is other people's knowledge. He says, successful people are like radar screens, constantly sweeping the horizons of their lives, searching in books and magazines and tapes and articles and conferences for ideas and insights they can use to help them achieve their goals faster. That is the secret of very successful people in the world. They read all the time. And I get it. With technology, I have my phone right here because it has my timer on it to know how long I can talk on the show today. But there are people, the wealthiest people among us are people who, like I said before, are sitting on the shoulders of other people who've come before them and they've written their wisdom down. And in today's culture with technology and society, most people, they get away from reading books. I'm telling you, if you really want to leverage your time and realize a life that is extraordinary, beyond extraordinary, you have to learn from people who've been there and done that. And unless you want to reinvent the whole wheel yourself, and take a lifetime to reinvent something instead of learning from people who've been there and done that. That's the choice I've made, because I know I'm not the brightest bulb in the room, but I do know that I read about people who are much smarter than me. So if I can learn from them, and I can't pay them $10,000 an hour to sit and teach me, but I can read their works, I can read their books, I can read their articles, I can read information about them and learn from them. That's other people's knowledge here is critical. He talks about other people's energy. He says highly effective people are always looking for ways to delegate and outsource lower value activities so they can have more time to do the few things that give them the highest payoff. Like I said earlier, you have to leverage your time because you only have a finite amount of time. We're only here for a flicker, just a flicker, a small amount of time. You can also learn from other people's failures. Yep. You can also learn from other people's mess-ups. Benjamin Franklin once said, man can either buy his wisdom or borrow it. By buying it, he pays full price in personal time and treasure, but by borrowing it, listen, he capitalizes on the lessons learned from the failures of others. I'll say that a few times in this show today, that if you really want to get far beyond your peers and far beyond the people in your own life, then you're going to have to learn from other people who have come before you. And some of those people have been here and died a long time ago, but they have written stuff down. They have written books that you should read, that you should invest in, that will teach you and will help you go much, much farther, much, much faster than anybody around you. He says in his books that we can also learn from other people's ideas. One good idea is all you need to start a fortune. He says that you can also learn from other people's contacts. He says on page 23, each person you know knows many other people, and many of whom can be helpful to you. Many people can be helpful to you. It's not necessarily, what they can give you, because as one guy said, he's very rich. Really, really rich. He says he can't stand people who come to him and ask him for money, but he does respect people who come to him and ask him for wisdom and how he did certain things. Big difference. Other people's experiences and their knowledge and their contacts. Brian says on page 24, The primary way you multiply yourself is by organizing and working with other people who have the skills and abilities that are complementary to your own. Let me talk about that for just a minute. Early in my career, I thought that in order to be at a certain level, I had to be really good at every level between where I am and where I really needed to be, or that I strove to be. But I found out over a period of years that I don't need to be good at everything. I need to be good at just a few things and then put people in place in my world that are much better at areas that I am either weak in or I don't need to be focused on. That is to leverage other people's talents. I'm asking you today to think about your own focus in your own life and how you can literally rewire what you're doing every day in your life that can project you forward in a way that's beyond your wildest imagination. I'm asking you to think outside the box in this, at least in this arena, in this way. He says on page 25, half of the average person's working time is simply wasted. He said, in other words, if you waste time at work by socializing or engaging in low-value activities, the work itself does not go away. He shares a story. Consider the story of a little girl who goes to her mother and asks, Mommy, why does Daddy bring home a briefcase full of work every night and work all evening and never spend any time with us? Mommy replies, Honey, you have to understand, Daddy can't get all his work done at the office during the day. That's why he has to bring it home and work on it in the evening. This little girl looks up at Mommy and says, why don't they just put him in a slower class? Wow. I'm asking you today to maybe reprioritize some things that you've been doing in your life that maybe if it's readjusted with some tips I've shared here so far, to refocus your life in a way to do things that are more productive for the long term that can get you to a place that you've been really trying to get to anyway. He says on page 26, identify the few tasks that contribute the greatest value to your work. He said, be adamant about discontinuing tasks that are of little importance. I've had to learn that the hard way. I've had to stop doing things that don't matter. Think about that a minute. Do you do things out of habit that don't really matter in the long run of doing things in life? I've had to cut out considerable stuff in my life over 25 years that really took up time that I didn't need to be wasting because I could have invested that time in something more valuable, not only to me, but to my family and other people around the world. So Brian Tracy says, there's 5 questions that you need to ask yourself. What am I trying to do? Write it down. What am I trying to do? Number 2, how am I trying to do it? Number 3, what are my assumptions? Number 4, what if my assumptions were wrong? Number 5, what would I have done differently if my key assumptions were wrong? What would you do differently if your key assumptions were wrong? He says, always be willing to ask, how else could I go about achieving this same result? Brian Tracy is a guy, he traveled the world, he learned from the very best. He sat on the shoulders of giants, like I'm recommending that you do, for the sake of not only helping himself get farther ahead faster, but also helping other people get farther ahead faster. I'm asking you to maybe consider refocusing your life in several areas in your own world. He says on page 31, one way to become more flexible is to let go of your ego and get it out of the way. He says, detach yourself from the situation and be more concerned with what's right rather than who's right. That was something I had to overcome 20, 25 years ago because my ego was fairly large and I didn't want to look like I was wrong. But in fact, once I realized it didn't matter who was right or wrong, it's what was right and what was wrong. So if I made the mistake, I should fess up into it. I messed up. And then I can get beyond the mess up and hopefully learn from it. I'm asking you to consider refocusing your life. That's the purpose of the show today. To think about how you can readjust, realign, refocus your life in a way that you can get so much more done in half the time or less than what you've been doing up for all these years so far. He says on page 32, always work from a list. He says, think on paper. Working from a list keeps you on track and give you a visual record of accomplishments. I was at a seminar with him back in the 90s, and during his speech, he pulled out a list. He says, this is my to-do list, and as I accomplish certain things on the list, I check off the list because it's done. Having stuff in writing impacts you in a dramatic way. So I'm asking you today, again, there's so much more I can share. I'm running out of time real fast. If you want to be productive, if you want to be focused, there are ways that you can readjust your life in a way that can dramatically give you more time, that can enable you to focus on what's most important in life, because you only have one life. That's all you have. You only have a certain amount of time, a certain amount of years, a certain amount of daylight in the day to get stuff done. I'm asking you to read from the masters. Get Brian Tracy's book, Focal Point. Get it. It'll change your life in a dramatic way. My name is John Carver. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back real soon.